Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Fort Collins Book Fest 5-year celebration. My name is Monique, and today we're celebrating our first 5 years of the Fort Collins Book Festival, a virtual celebration of books and brews, writings and riffs, food and thought, big science, and the great outdoors. As always, we are also celebrating the importance of literature, books, writing, and libraries. Check out the virtual program at www.focobookfest.org. We have book talks, discussions, panels, prose, and poetry readings over the next 2 weekends, all completely free, so please join us and make sure to share with your friends and family. Before we get to our session, I'd like to thank our sponsors. This festival could not happen without our generous sponsors. You can check the entire list at the end of the session. Today's event is produced by Poudre River Public Library District in partnership with CSU Morgan Library. Our presenting sponsor is City of Fort Collins Fort Fund. Further support has been provided by Friends of the Poudre Library District, Friends of Morgan Library, Lilla B. Morgan Endowment Fund, Downtown Development Authority, Liggett Johnson and Goodman PC, Front Range Community College, Downtown Fort Collins Creative District, the Gardens at Spring Creek, Fort Collins Public Media, Old Firehouse Books, and our media partners, KUNC and 105.5 The Colorado Sound. We'd like to give a special thanks to Northern Colorado writers for presenting all 4 of our writers' workshops. Thank you to all of them. And thank you so much for supporting our 5th annual FOCO Book Festival. Now, without further delay, let's get to Cultivating Place with Jennifer Jewell. Jennifer Jewell is a gardener, garden writer, and gardening educator and advocate. Since 2016, she has written and hosted the award-winning weekly public radio program and podcast, Cultivating Place, Conversations on Natural History and the Human Impulse to Garden, a co-production of North State Public Radio in Chico, California. She is the author of The Earth in Her Hands, 75 Extraordinary Women Working in the World of Plants. Jennifer has been writing about gardening professionally since 1998, and her work has appeared in Gardens Illustrated, House and Garden, Natural Home, Old House Journal, Colorado Homes and Lifestyles, and Pacific Horticulture. She worked as native plant garden curator for the Gateway Science Museum on the campus of California State University, Chico, from 2009 to 2018. She lives, gardens, hikes in the rich biodiversity of interior Northern California, on traditional lands of the Mechoopda Maidu people, in the company of her daughters and her partner, John Whittlesey, whenever possible. Jennifer's program will be followed by a tour of Fort Collins Spring Creek Gardens with Lauren Springer. We'd like to especially thank the Gardens at Spring Creek for their support. Following the tour, we will have a live Q&A with Jennifer. Please feel free to submit your questions for Jennifer on Facebook Live throughout the session. We hope you enjoyed today's program. Thanks for being here. Let's get started.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Jewell, and I'm so pleased to be here for the 5th annual Fort Collins Book Festival this year. I was born in Loveland, Colorado in 1965, and some of my earliest memories include playing in the dirt under the potting table at the Berthoud greenhouses where my mother worked, and from which she went on to become a professional gardener and floral designer, and where my father earned his PhD in wildlife biology at the university. So it feels like coming home to be speaking with you today. I'm going to share my screen now so that you can see my presentation slides and why we are here together. So I am the author of a book called The Earth in Her Hands, 75 Extraordinary Women Working in the World of Plants. It was published by Timber Press in March of this year, actually on March 3rd, in honor of International Women's Day and for National Women's History Month. So these women and their work and their passion for plants and gardens and the natural world and leveraging that love to make the world a better place, that's why we're here. But before we get to that, I would like to share just a little bit more about me and what I do and how I came to write this book. I am the creator and host of Cultivating Place, Conversations on Natural History and the Human Impulse to Garden. It's a public radio program and podcast hosted by North State Public Radio and co-produced by them here in Chico, California, where I moved in 2007 from Loveland, Fort Collins area. They have a very similar feel to them in terms of being small, rural towns with agriculturally based universities and a lot of access to beautiful natural spaces, from mountains to rivers to plains and meadows and riparian corridors. I started Cultivating Place because after writing for glossy magazines for 10 years and focusing on what gardens looked like and how beautiful they were, that sort of two-dimensional, aspirational aesthetic was not what I wanted to focus on. It became more and more clear to me that that world of perfect photographed gardens on magazine pages was not why I gardened, and it was not what I was talking about when I talked about what gardens were and why they were important and who gardeners were and why they engaged in what they engaged in. So I moved to Chico, California, and I went to my public radio program station, North State Public Radio, and I said, you need a garden program and I am the woman to get it for you. And so I created this program, and in 2016, it became a 1 hour long, more globally focused program under the name of Cultivating Place. Cultivating Place is based on a premise that gardens and gardeners are powerful intersectional agents and spaces of change, positive change in our world that make our world a better place. In sort of contrast to the way they are often discussed or presented in public and mainstream media as being very pretty things and sometimes very expensive things, but not very necessary things, not things that change the world. In 2017, when Timber Press came to me and asked if I would be interested in writing a book on women in horticulture right now, I understood that I did want to write it, but that it had to come from this same lens that I produced my program. It could not be a pretty pictures coffee table book. It had to be a book about powerful, forceful leadership and voice in this world through people, women specifically, attachment and passion for plants and the land. One of their parameters, Timber Press's parameters, when we first got started was that it just couldn't be about dead English white women. And that made me laugh at the time. And it's true. I was not interested in writing about dead English white women. And as interesting and as well documented as they are, and with many contributions to the horticultural world that we live in, they were not what I found interesting in horticulture today, here and now. And so I had to come up with a couple of parameters in order to write this book. And those parameters are really conceits, right? So the first conceit is that to write a book about only women is sexist. And in a world that needs a whole lot less sexism, I have to believe that this is sexist for a reason, and that reason is representation. The other parameter that, and we'll talk more about representation in a minute, the other parameter that we had to come up with was sort of time frame and number of women that we would talk about in the book. To pick 75 women is just a random number, a number that I could accomplish in the course of 1 year to write the book. What I ultimately determined was that they would all be living women, that their work would be current, and that their work would have somehow expanded our understanding of what it means to be horticultural. So ultimately, based on my public radio program and podcast, these were the areas of sort of professional interest or focus that I thought were of most immediate importance to me, and fields in which really interesting things were happening, where there were more women speaking, more women coming to the fore, more women succeeding at changing the culture of these fields. Now, when you think about women and representation, when you think about representation in any way, the important thing to me was not whether there had been a lot of women or were more women now, but that there was at least some women in each field, and that there was a diversity of women across a wide range of geographies in our world that I would talk about, and that and whose stories I found to be transformational for all of us in some ripple out effect. And the reason this representation is important might be obvious, but I want to walk through it for you now. If you have just one woman, especially if it is a woman with a diverse or non-traditional route to get into this field, you change what career access in that field looks like. If you have just one woman in a field, especially a field that may not have had very many women in positions of leadership before this, you change the experiential diversity that is making decisions at that table in that field. If you change the experience that's brought to a table and is making decisions, you change the values and priorities that are being held and that are being used to make decisions at that table. You change these three things and you change what leadership looks like in our world. And when you change what leadership looks like, you change everything. You have the capacity, finally, to change what our individual and communal health and well-being look like and feel like and are. You change environmental health and well-being, especially through these plants women. You change economic health and well-being, you change cultural norms and social justice, and you change what all of these combine to mean, and that is a true and representative cultural literacy. So this is the book, and it took me 1 year to write. And if you had told me in 2017 that I would be speaking to you in 2020 and that we would be faced with cultural transformation at a greater rate than we have seen in decades, if you had told me we would be faced with a health crisis, the likes of which we have not seen in decades, if you had told me we would be at a political and environmental climate change impasse, I might not have believed you on one of those, but I certainly wouldn't have believed you on all three of those. And yet, the work of these women, to me, illustrate beyond any question that even individual people, starting from where they are, can make an enormous impact in our world for the better. Not as a trickle-down kind of decision-making leadership, but as a horizontal, collaborative, and meaningful, personally and globally. You make a difference with this kind of intersection. I'm going to introduce you to a couple of the women that I focused on in the book. Now, when it came to putting the book together, I couldn't decide how to organize the book. None of these women, just like none of you listening, just like not me, just like not my garden, we aren't able to be categorized as just one thing. And these women, beyond any people that I know perhaps, were unwilling to be contorted into one category. Every single one of these women is having an impact in every one of those categories that I just read off to you, from health and well-being individually, to the environment, to the economy, to our cultural literacy. And so ultimately, I organized them alphabetically. But I want to introduce you to at least one woman who is making a demonstrable, one woman in each of these categories who is making a powerful impact on one of these categories. This is Leah Penneman. I believe her sister Naima is speaking at the book festival as well, and I couldn't be more pleased to be in her company. Leah Penneman and her husband, college graduates, young professionals, made a very conscious decision to live in a Northeast urban environment and to have as little carbon footprint as they could. And in this Northeast urban environment, they came to realize that even with their education privilege, even with their job privilege, Leah at the time was teaching middle school and high school math and science. And even with these privileges, they could not easily get to a grocery store that had fresh food. They had to load their children into strollers or into backpacks and take 1 to 2 buses to get to the grocery store that had the fresh food that they wanted to feed to their family. And this, Leah was very, very clear on, was not a food desert. It was food apartheid. It was a systemic construction that precluded fresh fruit and vegetables being available in the community in which she lived, predominantly a community of color. And she had a fire lit in her that this was not okay, and that she was going to work to do something about it. And she was going to start a farm that grew fresh fruits and vegetables to supply food to this community that she lived in and called home and family. And so she and her husband and their children went, they worked for several years, they saved money, they found farmland, they started their farm, Soul Fire Farm. And they started off with a CSA that provided fresh fruits and vegetables to the community in which they had come, from which they had come. But it was in the course of building this farm and creating this CSA that Leah also began to recognize that there was a disturbing and disproportionate disconnection from the land and people of color, specifically her Black community. So from starting the CSA, she then launched an initiative to help educate people and reattach them, reconnect them to the land and the legacy of beauty and contribution that Black people have brought to our country and our world. And once she started on this educational pathway, she also began to expand into training farmers of color to have farms, and then to access land, and then training groups of people in communal well-being and spirituality, and reconnecting historic power and contribution in places that they had been forcibly removed and erased. In her book, Farming While Black, she documents the history of the farm, and she documents a much longer and remarkable history of Black horticultural and agricultural contribution in the US, changing the narrative that our culture has had on these subjects for hundreds of years. And if you are not familiar with her work, I very much hope you will look into the farm and look into her book. In environmental health and well-being, I want to introduce you to Dr. Elaineingham. Now, of course, many of you might know her because she did some of her groundbreaking and initial work there in Fort Collins. And she was one of the early coiners of the term soil food web. And it was her integration of soil science understanding with her husband's research topics in nematology that allowed her to start resisting and reframing a long-held belief that the life in the soil did not play a role or have a purpose that benefited the plants that grew in the soil. And it was a long legacy of land grant universities and the Green Revolution, and a reliance and faith in chemical industry to support soils that had been depleted. And she kept being told by people before her that there was that life in the soil, but it didn't really do anything. And so to just focus on the NPK and how to supplement it. And she kept coming back to the question of, well, if that's true, if we need to supplement the soil in order to feed the plants, then explain old growth forests to me. And she just kept working at it, and slowly, she began to reveal and articulate the life and the truth of the life in the soil that we all take for granted today. And without that, we might still be in the chemical dark ages that we were in for so many years. Her work has radically transformed what soil science means and how organic agriculture understands how it functions. In economic health and well-being, I want to introduce you to Erin. Erin is the founder of Floret Flowers, and she is a floral farmer and a floral designer, and she is a many-time author at this point. But most importantly, she is the founder of a flower farm revolution in our country, and a revolution in local sustainable floral supply and demand in our country that has really transformed the way the cut flower industry in the US works today. In the late 1990s, early 2000s, there were a couple of intersecting kind of revelations in the garden world. In part, it was kicked off by the slow food movement, and it then followed with a book by another woman in The Earth in Her Hands, Amy Stewart, researching and writing a book entitled Flower Confidential, in which she really researches and lays bare the toxic and carbon heavy industry of the cut flower import world, and how a long legacy of foreign trade and tariffs and exchanges had created an opportunity for the cut flower industry to be almost wholly sent to other countries to grow the flowers that we consume and purchase every year, and then have them shipped back to the US at lower cost per stem in a store, but not lower cost to the world at large, not lower cost to the economies of scale in our country, not lower cost to the people trying to make a living working with flowers that they loved in the US, and not at a lower cost to the countries where the cut flower industry had been outsourced, countries where the living wage was less, the standards for environmental protections were less, and the standards for workmen's and work people's care and well-being were less, and or had no oversight at all. With her launching of workshops and books teaching people how to start their own flower farms and make a viable business out of it, she has revolutionized the environmental impact, but much more importantly, the economic impact of what it means to grow and provide flowers to an industry that is hungry for them. And what's interesting to me is that working in the sector of flowers, I think this is one of the areas of horticulture that people are most apt to say, oh, well, that's very nice, that's very pretty, but is it really that useful? Can it really make an impact? And I will tell you that Erin and Amy Stewart and Deborah Prinzing of the Slow Flower Society, they are economic drivers of small scale businesses and growers who are changing the economies of their local communities. They are changing the environmental impact of their local communities, and they have become economic drivers across the industry nationwide. When I say cultural norms and social justice, let me give you an example of this. When I looked for the leaders in public policy and administration, I looked to the large-scale horticultural societies, the large urban botanical gardens and research organizations across our country. One of the things that's interesting is that it wasn't until, I believe, the mid to late 1980s that a woman was named as a leader of a major botanic garden in our country at all. It wasn't until 2018, late in the year, after I had already written my rough draft for the book, that a woman was named leader of the New York Botanic Garden in New York. Mary Pat Matheson is the current CEO and president of the Atlanta Botanical Garden. She moved to the garden in the mid-early 2000s, and she came from Red Butte Garden in Utah. When she came to the Atlanta Public Botanical Garden, she recognized really quickly that the garden, like many cultural institutions, museums, gardens, art galleries, and other cultural arts and literary institutions around our country, it was not serving the population in which it lived. It was not serving the whole of the demographics in which the institution sat. And she knew that no matter what the industry of museums and botanical gardens at large said, that she had to change this if she was going to make the Atlanta Botanical Garden viable and relevant going into the next decade, if not century. She put together a list of stakeholders from the community, from the city, from the plant world, and she began to evaluate the situation. It was predominantly a donor base and membership base of wealthy white people in a city that was not predominantly wealthy and white, but was vastly multicultural, of all socioeconomic backgrounds, and that in order to reach a larger population who would believe the Atlanta Botanical Garden to be of interest to them, she actually had to incorporate these other communities into the planning and the decision making. And so she did something really incredible. She decided to not just make a performative change on one level. She instead decided to restructure how they did everything at the garden from all levels, from leadership and decision making to who was teaching and developing programs there, to what those programs were about and what they focused on, to who the membership would be, to who the donors would be and be reached out to, and to the staff on the ground in the garden. So that no matter who you were, what age, what color your skin, what socioeconomic background your household, what education level, you ended up in this garden and you could see yourself there. Now, she did this in a couple of really interesting ways. She put together a really meaningful table of stakeholders to help make these decisions and brainstorm ideas. And then they went and got a grant. They got a grant that allowed for them over a period of 5 years to offer free membership to the garden to every single public servant in the greater Atlanta area. Now, what this meant was that teachers and postal delivery people and fire and police and bus drivers all of a sudden had a paid membership to the Atlanta Botanical Garden, where previously they perhaps wouldn't have considered and or wouldn't have believed they could afford a membership. The grant allowed for them to have free membership, I believe, for the first 3 years, and then a staggered increase in membership cost over the next 2 years. So that, in one way, started to get people who hadn't been to the garden before to the garden. Simultaneously, they formed alliances and collaborative programs with the historical Black colleges in Atlanta and the entire Atlanta public school system. With both of these systems, they created internships and research scholarships and docent training and field trip opportunities so that young people on their way in school, whether that be at the graduate level, the research and graduate level, the undergraduate level, or the high school and below level, had an opportunity to come work at the garden. And in working there, they showed up as representative for the people who were visiting the garden. Once this membership started to slowly shift, then this team of decision makers decided to offer surveys and feedback and input so that the programs and exhibitions and plant research and plant display gardens that they were putting together actually were of interest to the cultural and historical and everyday needs of the people who worked and came to the garden. At a time when gardens were losing membership and losing donors at a historic pace, Mary Pat Matheson turned around the Atlanta Botanical Garden to being one of the most funded, one with the highest membership rates, and one with the least attrition rates in a diversity of households in her city. She would be the first to tell you that the most important thing was that she did not do it on her own. She included all of the people whose input she wanted at that decision-making table. And that collaborative networking, horizontal leadership made all the difference. In cultural norms and social justice as well, I want to talk about Robin Wall Kimmerer as one of the preeminent Indigenous as well as scientific voices of our time. Her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, was published to such national and international resonance and acclaim. It came at a time when I think people were starving to hear information of hope and meaning like this. And as a young woman of Indigenous descent, on a path to become a botanist, she at university level came to understand that there was a disconnection and a dissonance and a disrespect between what she understood traditional ecological knowledge to be and what she understood Western science to be. And she has literally made it her career passion to bring the best of both of those, the Western scientific tradition and the traditional ecological knowledge that includes morality and relationship and reciprocity and respect, to bring those two together for the better of us all. That is the intersection that she finds most powerful as a plantswoman and as an educator, as a professor at SUNY University. And it is that ethos that is articulated so beautifully in Braiding Sweetgrass and has changed the minds of millions of people who have read it as to what it means to love plants, what it means to feel related to plants, and why it is that we are important as humans to the plant-human relationship. And then in cultural literacy, which all of these other topics really boil down to, I want to introduce you to your very own Lauren Springer. Now, one of the truths of the horticultural world, especially if you're following mainstream media, as I did writing for public and glossy magazines and widely distributed magazines like House and Garden and Gardens Illustrated, one of the things you are quick to notice is just how bi-coastal and European-centric our cultural visualizations are. To read those magazines, you would honestly feel as though gardeners of import did not exist in the middle of the United States or outside of London or Paris. That all of the important gardens and gardeners in our country are along the Northeast coast or they are along the Pacific coast. And even coming from Chico, California, which is 3 hours inland from the coast in California, you would never see information about what it means to garden in my climate and my geography, in my kind of watershed. And Lauren Springer was one of the first women that I knew I wanted to be in this book. Ever since she first established her name in the Loveland Fort Collins area as the author of Undaunted Garden all those years ago, she has made it clear that good plants and good plantsmanship, that gardening and plant literacy that is based in the climate and in the soil and in the topography and history of where you live is of vital importance to the most beautiful, most dynamic of gardens. Gardens that speak to us of the place in which they are grounded, gardens that speak to us about living within limits, not limits that hold us back, but limits that actually set us free to have beautiful gardens that work with our environments, not to the detriment of them. Now, we are lucky enough to have a 5-minute presentation by Lauren coming next to show us some of the beauty she has created in her new public garden space there at the gardens at Spring Creek in Fort Collins. And her garden, as is appropriate, is entitled The Undaunted Garden. Women like Lauren, like Robin Wall Kimmerer, like Erin Benzakein, and the others in the book, one of the things that they remind us of is that we are a part of our larger culture, that gardens and gardening are something that all cultures over all time and space have leaned into, that it is part of what it means to be human, like literature and music and great art. Gardens and horticultural knowledge and passion are there. I want to read you a quote that's up on the screen here by Vandana Shiva, one of the women in the book, and a keen and insightful plantswoman and internationally renowned organic, local, seed-saving advocate. A woman who correlates very forcefully the importance of how we treat women and how we treat human rights and how we treat our planet as being very interdependent. She says, the future is based on a core intelligence of evolution with the plants. Artificial intelligence might help in algorithms to manipulate how and what we think, but it will not contribute to the next stage of human consciousness, of human evolution as a species, just one species among many on this beautiful earth as part of Earth family. When I think about all of the women in the book, and I think about us all being on this planet together, I am reminded with every garden, with every plant each of these gardeners loves and holds forth, that it is not about the earth in their hands or her hands, it is about the earth in all of our hands. And I hope that you will take this list of women not as a final list, not as a set endpoint, rather as an invitation to lift up and celebrate and support and advocate for all good humans doing this kind of transformative and expansive earth work in our world today. Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure. I will look forward to answering questions from the audience live, and I hope you enjoy the presentation on the gardens at Spring Creek. Thank you.
Now we'll see a local example of Cultivating Place with a tour of the gardens at Spring Creek with Lauren Springer. Let's go ahead and start the video tour.
Welcome to the gardens on Spring Creek, the City of Fort Collins Community Botanic Garden. Through an important partnership with the City of Fort Collins, we offer 12 acres of carefully curated gardens that are an amazing place to come with your family or on your own to rest, to heal, to celebrate, to connect with nature, to explore, to learn, and to just be inspired. Whether you're watching the bees in our children's garden or getting up close to a zebra longwing in our North American butterfly house, there are ample opportunities for connection. Another important part of the mission of the Gardens on Spring Creek is to inspire stewardship through horticulture. Nowhere is that more relevant and tangible than here in our Garden of Eden, this 3/4 acre food garden. Thousands of pounds of produce every year to our Larimer County Food Bank through the Planet Forward program. All our gardens aim to inspire plant lovers to think about the impact of what they're planting. It may be for beauty, for pollinators, for sustainability, or to flourish in our daunting Colorado seasons. A great example of that is our Undaunted Garden. We have Lauren Springer, the garden's designer and horticulturalist, here to tell us about creating a regionally resonant garden.
This 3/4 acre, it's called the Undaunted Garden, basically named after my first book. Undaunted being all about the fact that it's kind of hard to grow plants in our soil and our climate, and using plants here and showcasing plants here in beautiful ways, plants that can take our climate and can tolerate our soils and thrive. So it's all about low water plants, about plants that can stand heavy clay soils, high pH, super cold winters, dry cold winters. We don't get dependable snow cover. And also sometimes brutally hot summers, hail, all kinds of things. Fires this year, a lot of pollution from the fires. And still have a garden that's full of plants that are doing well, diverse, and attracting lots of pollinators, many natives here. It's about 60% native and 40% plants that are adapted to our region, many from South Africa, from the Mediterranean, Central Asia, areas that similarly have difficult soils and challenging climates. This garden here, the chaparral garden, is really actually, in my sense, I think the most useful and beautiful for our climates. It's very low maintenance because the shrubs and these long-lived perennials need very little care once they're established. And it has a lot of texture. And our textures out here and our colors out here are different than in the Midwest or on the coasts. It's a lot more silver, gray-green, not this lush green look. And the textures aren't as bold and as lush. They're finer textured, scruffier looking, and they play with light and wind really beautifully. Lots of grasses, fine textured things like this rabbit brush, and silver plants like that Artemisia right here. Those kinds of plants are really the cornerstones of a chaparral garden. And there are a lot of bulbs in this garden, which give you a lot of spring color, and then they die down, and then you have these kinds of plants to carry the rest of the season and on in through the winter. This is the smallest section of the Undaunted Garden, but in some ways it's probably the most exciting. It is at this point in time the largest collection of winter hardy cacti showcased in an outdoor garden setting in the United States. And there is at least 36 different species of cacti here and over 400 individual Long-lived, they play with the sun, their spines, their flowers are translucent, so when you have backlighting in the early sculpture. And that said, if you only have all this armature, all these spines. So it's important to mix in other plants to soften I have gorgeous flowers. They come in all colors but blue, and they're very large in most cases and translucent, and pollinators love them, but they bloom for a very short period of time. So if you want color in here, except for in late spring and early summer when the cacti are blooming, you've got to introduce some other companion plants for that kind of blossom color. The other thing to think about when you're gardening with cacti and when you're creating a cactus garden is to think about incorporating rock. Because in nature, they grow a lot of times in very stony parts of the desert. They like to have rock mulch around them. That's what they're used to in the desert. That's the kind of things that are covering the soil in the desert. It's not bark mulch, it's not pieces of wood or compost, it's little pieces of rock. And the other thing is that stone helps warm the soil. It helps reflect heat on the cacti. And here in Colorado, they want a little more heat than we sometimes can give them. So some of these are native to the Southwest, further south and further west. Many from New Mexico and Arizona, and some even as far down as northern Mexico. And so if we can increase that heat and also protect their roots in the winter a little bit with these rocks, the larger rocks, and with the rock mulch, we make them much happier. And they also look really good with the rocks. So I would highly recommend using rocks with your cacti.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We explored, we learned, you saw a little bit about who we are, and we hope to see you soon at the Gardens on Spring Creek.
Thanks to Lauren for giving us a tour of the gardens. Now it's time for our live Q&A session with Jennifer Jewell. Please feel free to submit any questions you have on Facebook Live, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So Jennifer, I have a couple of questions for you if you're ready. So the first question is, what does it mean to be a woman in plants?
Well, you know, I get into this a little. First of all, let me just say how nice it is to be here and what a lovely tour of the garden that was. That's just a beautiful garden. The colors and the textures and the seasonality is beautiful. And I would say that, you know, what it means to be a woman in plants is as diverse as our gardens are, as our landscapes are. There are 1,000 different ways to interpret that. And I think one of the important things at this juncture in our cultural and global lives is that when we hear that phrase, woman in plants, we're very careful not to have one set image in our minds of how old she is, what her background is, what her education is, and that we seek out a greater and greater diversity of both life experience and cultural education and academic education, and that you look for people that have passion and that are looking, you know, that women in plants today seem to be right at the sort of nexus of wanting to make the world a better place through their passion with plants.
Awesome. How does horticulture intersect with our everyday world?
You know, the better question there is, how does it not? intersect with our everyday world. I mean, I see you, a young woman with plants all around you. Those are actual house plants. But then you look at your clothes, you look at your makeup, you look at your furniture, you look at your view out your window. And in fact, horticulture is all around us all the time. It is that human cultivation of plants for a specific purpose. And there is very little we do in this world that does not eventually go down the food chain of both actual food or actual utility, or how we even breathe the air we breathe, Monique, to come back to our reliance on plants. And in this time of COVID and general health concerns, smoke all over the West, where you are, where I am, those plants at work every day for us, filtering our air, greening our spaces, and improving our views on everything. Everything comes back to horticulture, if you ask me.
That's awesome. Thank you. So I have a question here about your book. You mentioned in the book that the many challenges of our world can be met through cultivating an interdependence with plants.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk more about that, please?
Sure. This is one of those beliefs that's really at the heart of every single thing I do, both on the podcast and what I write and what I do on social media. And that is that I honestly believe that gardeners and lovers of plants and the natural world, we are really powerful intersectional agents and spaces of change in our world. And the way we intersect is the way that anything important to our overall cultural literacy intersects with these things of importance. In that, and when I say that, what I mean is that, you think of the aspects of our life that are universal across time, across space, across culture, across socioeconomic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, food and music and literature and gardens, cultivating plants for whatever that might be, for vegetables, for flowers, for medicine, for beauty, for pollinators. These are things that all of those other ways that we are divided as people, we can come together in a place of plants and all find common ground. And therefore, that common space can allow us to transcend our disagreements about environment and therefore find ways to address environmental collapse and crises. It can help us transcend our views on politics or gender or religion or whatever might divide us. We can find this common ground and use it as a way to go forward. And I'll give you an example of that. You look at women in the book like Jamaica Kincaid or Leah Penneman or Edwina von Gall, very different women on the face of it. And yet, and I would say this is true of every woman in the book, they have married their love of plants with one of the things they are most concerned about in this world. For Leah Penneman, it was the communal health and well-being of her Black community in upstate New York. That was where it started. And then it just radiated out into improving the representation and the authenticity of the Black community in the world of agriculture and horticulture and land, period. And therefore, she increased the literacy of all of us by raising those issues. Same with Edwina von Gall, who is a landscape designer out on Long Island and designs gardens for people like Calvin Klein and Ina Garten. And she came to recognize that gardens could also be a potential source of pollutants and degradation of our watersheds and larger landscapes. And she put her whole heart and soul and career into changing that and making sure that all of her clients and all of her education was turned towards eliminating chemicals in our gardens across the board and learning how to not rely on them and not use them as a default set for our gardens. So that idea that we can take what we love most about our plant passion and hook it to what we are the most scared about in this world, and the one can help move the other into a more positive place. I think that is one of the great lessons I took from immersing myself in the work of these women.
Absolutely. Thank you. So you mentioned decolonizing your garden.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? And how can we accomplish this?
Well, all I can say is my personal experience with this work. So I was a young mother in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I have been a plant person and gardener for much longer than that. And it was in the mid 90s that Jamaica Kincaid's series of essays in the New Yorker came out. Those essays were originally compiled into a book called My Garden Book, which for anyone out there listening for whom this is of interest, that is absolutely required reading. And what she sort of explores in this book is what education her garden brought to her. And the way she phrases that is, the garden brings the world to me. And when she says the world, she means the world and all of human history, which, as we know, is really complicated, is really messy. It is as full of, delight and triumph as it is of absolutely gross injustice and tragedy and loss. So she becomes a gardener. She was born in Antigua. She came to the United States as a young woman. She becomes an avid gardener. And like many avid gardeners, she starts collecting plants. She collects peonies and dahlias and, you name it. She collects these plants that we would recognize as garden plants. And she starts researching them out of her own natural curiosity. And what she quickly becomes aware of is that a great many of the plants we love in our gardens are actually coming to us from far, far away. And their names have a history behind them that erases the history that came before those names. An example that she cites all the time is the dahlia, which is a ceremonial, traditional, valued plant in South and Central America, going back eons, centuries and centuries. And it was, found, collected, taken back to Europe by a colonizing white man. Its name was changed to the name of a white European man, and then introduced to gardens around the world. Now, Jamaica Kincaid is not saying that we can go back and change that truth. Like, that is a truth. It happened. What we can do, though, is hold ourselves accountable for learning more about not just the plants, but the places they originally came, the people who originally valued them and treasured them, and reinstate that narrative so that the dahlia is no longer a story of erasure. It is a story of, colonization and stealing and erasure, and then redemption, and then reinstatement. And I think that we need to do that with all of the ways we think about gardening. I think, for too many people, you hear the word garden, you hear the word gardener, and what comes up is an image that's been given to us by mainstream consumer media. And it looks a lot like a suburban garden with a middle-aged, middle-class white woman in it. And I know that I visually look like that image I am trying to overcome with what I do. And because everyone gardens and everyone values plants and seeds and food and this connection. And so that's what I mean by decolonize our garden.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Sure.
So we have a question here from Facebook. What are the barriers for women in horticulture? And how can we begin to tear down these barriers?
That is such a great question. And, I would say that in many cases, they are the exact same barriers that they are in so many fields. When I say the word horticulture, I mean all of the areas of plant world, professional fields that inform horticulture. So this could be, botany and environmental science and plant collecting and plant breeding and plant introducing and nurseries and master gardener groups and garden clubs and garden writers and garden photographers and seed keepers. And so there's a great diversity of influence coming into this field. And I think one of the greatest things we can do is to expand our view of what's possible, so that even if there isn't a woman at a decision-making table in a field or in an organization that you would like to work at, go ahead and try. And I think, again, one of the greatest things we can do is keep finding the names and the faces and the work of people who are already at work in this field, and raising them up and lifting them and supporting them and sharing them as widely as we can. I think some of our greatest assets as women are that in most cases we have been taught to be culturally collaborative and networking. Now, sometimes that can hold us back, but sometimes that is exactly what can help move us all forward. And so if you are a woman like me who has been in the field for a while, and somebody opened that door for me, I don't know who it was. I don't know exactly every one of the people that opened doors that allowed me to do what I'm doing. All I know is the door was open for me. And therefore it is absolutely my job to make sure that that door stays open behind me. And I mentor and I encourage as many other women in all of these fields as I possibly can. I encourage them and I applaud them over and over again. And I think that was the feeling of every woman in the book that I interviewed, was this same sense of we need to stick together and keep encouraging good humans across the board, not sort of women exceptionalism, but just good humans in the work doing good things.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think we have time for one more question here.
Okay.
This is from Stacy on Facebook. What opportunities are there in Colorado to get involved in work that intersects food, justice, and social justice?
That is a really great question. And since I am based in California, I don't exactly have all of these answers for you. But what I would say is I would start by looking at there's a fantastic community garden in downtown Denver that works exactly on this. And if you, Stacy, on Facebook, DM me on Instagram or Facebook, Cultivating Place. It's cultivating_place. If you DM me that question, I will find you the name of that garden. But the Denver Botanic Garden would have information on this. The Pea Patches in Denver, that organization and community garden network, they will have information on this without question. The Denver Inner City Parish, I think, is doing some work around this, and I am sure there are more in the other urban environments.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for joining us today and for the wonderful session. That was awesome. And thanks again to our sponsors. That's about all the time we have today. And thank you to the attendees for all of your support. We really appreciate you all being here with us today. If you would like to purchase Jennifer or Lauren's books, please go to www.oldfirehousebooks.com/bookfest2020. Book plates are available from select authors. Please indicate in the comments section of your order if you're interested in a signed copy. And finally, please go to our Fort Collins Book Fest website, which is www.focobookfest.org, and fill out our survey. We rely on your input for future Fort Collins Book Festivals, so we really value your feedback. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all at our future sessions. Thanks,
Thank you so
Jennifer.
much. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.